Good morning, Chuck. I understand that you were a resident of Soho quite a few years ago. Can you tell me how you ended up in Soho?
Well, I moved to what became Soho in 1967. It didn't become Soho for several years. And when we moved in, there were maybe 10 people who lived between Canal and Houston.
Really?
Broadway, West Broadway. At night, we walked down the street. We'd see a light, and we'd say, oh, someone else lives here. It was, and it was nothing but rags and rats. The cottage industries had moved out, the small manufacturers who made hats or underwear or whatever. So artists have always been the Pied Pipers of real estate. We go where no one wants to live and make it fashionable and sexy and hot, and then people move in and then the artists can't live there anymore. Mm-hmm. It was called Hell's 100 Acres by the fire department, because they'd get a fire and then the heat of the fire would melt the cast iron and the whole building would come down, and there was always trapping firemen. Mm-hmm. So they didn't want to go in those buildings at all, they just let them burn. So the city finally acknowledged the fact that artists were living there, and they came up with AIR, Artist in Residence, and they allowed 2 artists per building. So in the front of each building it would say AIR 3 and 5, and the fire department now knew there were people living in the 3rd and 5th floor, and they were going to have to go in. Well, as you can imagine, that rule was broken immediately as buildings would fill up from the 1st floor to the 7th floor. So then there was the artist certification process. The only people who were supposed to live in what was Soho, what became Soho, were artists who passed the test. We had to submit our work to bureaucrats who decided that we were in fact artists. Of course, there were a lot of lawyers who all of a sudden had painting as a hobby, but because of the proximity to Wall Street. But it was a really interesting time.
How did you end up there?
I've been teaching in Massachusetts. After I left Yale, I had a Fulbright for a year, and then I went to Amherst, Massachusetts for 2 years to teach. And I started out an artist who also taught, and by the end of 2 years, I was a teacher who used to paint. So I left Amherst, and I moved in 1967. Moved down here. Leslie and I got married that first Christmas, and
and where did you live?
That was 27 Greene Street between Canal and Grand, and it backed up on Soho Lumber. Oh. And we looked over the top of Soho Lumber at the wonderful church that they tore down because it was sinking into the ground. There's a hotel there now.
And was that did you rent, or was that a co-op?
We rented, and I paid $150 a month for 2,500 square feet.
Gosh.
And friends of mine who got here a year or two earlier laughed hysterically because they were paying 50 or 75 or maybe 100. So, and then in 1970, a group of artists who lived in 101 Prince Street between what is
Mercer,
it?
I think
Mercer and Greene.
Yeah.
It's where Jerry's restaurant used to be.
Yeah.
We were about maybe the third co-op. Al Held and Alex Katz's building was the first, I think. And that there were all, let's see, who was in there? Well, Jack Beale had had 2 floors. I bought one of his. And then later Janet bought mine, Janet Fish. But Joe Zucker, Ray Parker.
A whole list of prominent artists at that time, right?
Yeah, we lived on the 7th floor and had a freight elevator. And if you had the elevator, you had to take everybody else up and down.
Yeah, I know that well, yeah. Who talked you into coming to Soho?
I think Al Held, who was a critic of mine at Yale, he made it seem doable, possible. So you don't want to take a teaching job in Des Moines. You'll never be heard of again. He said, go to New York. You can, put up sheetrock, or you can do something to make money, and it's all doable. It's not that hard. It's funny because Al and I fought like crazy when I was a student there. He came into my studio while I was in that building on Crown Street.
Street Hall?
No.
Street Hall?
On Crown Street.
Oh, okay.
Which is an old house. And I was on the ground floor front. Richard Serra was in the middle. Bryce Martin was behind that. Nancy Graves was in the attic. Stephen Posen. So Al Held came in, and I had to answer the payphone in the hallway. While I was doing that, he took white paper and stapled it right up to the middle of an all-white painting, all-black painting. Pretty dark painting. I came back and I couldn't believe it. So I threw him out of the studio and put a sign that he wasn't welcome to come anymore.
Stay out.
Into the studio. And when I had my first show at Bikert Gallery, which was on 81st Street, across the street from the Campbell Funeral Home, where all the abstract expressionists went when they died. I think it was maybe Philip Guston's. No. It was Mark Rothko's funeral. And all the artists were there. I was hanging my show. And Al Held came over with Jack Tworkoff, who was the head of the art school at the time, and Philip Guston, who was my critic as well. And I said to him, I put my arm around Al and I said, we disagreed about so many things and fought a lot. I said, but you were still very important to me, and I couldn't be making these paintings without you. And he said, you can't hang this shit on me.
Well, he was that kind of person, I know that, yeah. I know, I know. Did you have a job at that time in the city that allowed you to make money?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Much to my surprise, I got a teaching job in New York, which is impossible now, but at least was difficult then. And Don Nice had been in my class at Yale at the same time as he was the dean of the School of Visual Arts. And so he hired me right away. They only had an opening in the photography department. So I taught in photography for 2 years.
Really? Okay. Well, that's good. Now, the other thing I was going to ask you is that I noticed that I know a picture of one of your works that you created on Prince Street, the 22-foot long nude, right?
Right.
Do you think that having all that space gave artists freedom to work in a different scale, etc.?
I remember that Leo Castelli told me.
Go ahead. Want to start again?
Leo Castelli told me that the biggest mistake he ever made was opening a gallery in Soho.
Really?
Because he had the gallery, the Upper East Side in that townhouse, and he said people made, Rosenquist made F-111 by bending it around the walls. He said they were big enough. But he said once he opened up downtown, everybody made paintings that were too big to sell and too hard to show. And,
well, some people say that living some people say living in big spaces has transformed their work, and it has created also new work like ambient pieces and so forth.
Well, the opposite, I think, has happened. We have post-studio art because people can't afford a studio.
Now,
and I think it's made work much more conceptual. I know people.
Yeah.
One sculptor who's a friend of mine. He designs the piece on the back of a cocktail napkin while he's flying to Europe, and then gets there and builds it. It's never in a studio. It just goes straight from the cocktail napkin to
the exhibition.
Yeah.
Who's that?
Oh.
You're not going to tell me?
No.
Okay. Okay. So you made much bigger work because of that. Yeah.
I felt like the bigger they are, the longer they take to walk by. Therefore, the harder they are to ignore.
Yeah.
So I made. There were vertical rectangles in the height of the ceiling. I just crammed a rectangle between the floor and ceiling and got busy. But I wanted to rip the portrait loose from this scale. When I was in school, they used to say, you can't make a head larger than life size in a painting. And I always thought, well, that's
baloney.
That's pretty stupid. And by then, the pop artists of Rosenquist made some big heads. Warhols were getting bigger, although they were still easel sized. Later phase of his life.
Is there anyone who?
My girlfriend, I was at an opening last night for the people who lived in or worked in her studio in Brooklyn, in Gowanus. And the city just condemned the building and threw 30 artists out on the street with one 1 month's notice. And it's harder to be an artist today, I think, than ever. If in around 67, when I first showed, there were maybe 12 or 14 galleries that showed contemporary art at all. And they were all between 86th and 55th Street along Madison Avenue. And you start uptown, and you'd go downtown, you'd see every show. If you had a show, you were guaranteed that every artist in the art world would see your work. Now, you know, there are 200 galleries in Chelsea and 100 in the Lower East Side and probably 100 uptown. Actually, those numbers are probably too low. But at any rate, how many galleries do you go to in a month? Well, you get your circuit. I go here and there and there.
Yeah.
And unless the person is showing to one of those galleries that you go to, or unless you know them, and then go to a gallery you don't normally go to, it's very, very hard to be seen. And hard to make the work, hard to afford a space to make it in, hard to make a living while you're doing it. Remember, Richard Serra lived down in what's now Tribeca, and he had a studio down there as well. He lived with Nancy in Nancy Graves in Little Italy, but his studio was down in Tribeca, or what became Tribeca. I helped him make all of his early lead prop pieces and
Did you?
whatever. But no, why was I mentioning this?
Well, let me just ask you another question. So what you're saying is that Soho made art possible in a certain way, right?
It made a certain kind of art possible.
And made certain
And
art...
we got away from easel painting.
We got away from easel painting, yeah. Okay.
Oh, I was thinking about well, like my girlfriend's building, they have spaces that we wouldn't even have considered working in. It was like maybe 150 square feet, tops.
Really?
Probably smaller than that. A rabbit warren of spaces. And they paid $500 a month, which was considered, you know, an absolute steal for 100 square feet. Now she's looking for spaces in the neighborhood. A space that size is $1,500.
Gosh, yeah.
Well, you know, she likes to make big paintings, but she physically can't.
Yeah.
So it's forced artists back to the easel, I think.
Well, that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. Well, you know, I mean, things go in cycles and, you know, back and forth, depending on the conditions that dictate art, whatever. Now, I
don't see us returning to really inexpensive spaces. I mean, artists have moved farther away. So from Soho, they went to Tribeca. Tribeca was too expensive. They went to Long Island City or Brooklyn. Dumbo became a little city in itself. Now you can't afford a space in Dumbo. People are talking about Philadelphia. It's like Philadelphia is part of New York now, and people commute. I live and work most of the time in Long Beach, which is 45 minutes from Midtown Manhattan or from Soho, by train or by car. My friend Mark Greenwald lives in the upper Manhattan, up by the cloisters. I can get to Tribeca, I get to
Long Beach.
no, to on the west side.
Chelsea.
Chelsea. I can get to Chelsea in the same length of time from Long Beach as it takes him to get there from the upper reaches of Manhattan. So more and more artists are moving out there. It's at least in the same city.
Now, Soho was at one point really teeming with galleries and with people and with excitement. What was that like for you?
Well, I lived there for several years before anything much happened. Generally, it's thought that Paula Cooper opened the first one. But in fact, Richard Feigen opened the space.
Really?
On
Greene Street?
On Greene, just below Houston. Then Paula Cooper opened on Prince Street across from my studio. And then OK Harris opened on West Broadway. That was the first batch. And the invasion began. And that drove up prices too. Now galleries can't afford to be there. So, same with living on Bond Street. When I moved to Bond Street, it was still the biggest crack street in lower Manhattan. The gutters were full of crack files. Phil Glass's then wife made collages from those crack files. Oh, I was going to say that Richard Serra had a pickup truck. He moved his art, he moved other people's art. Then he was beginning to make enough money, didn't have to do that. So he gave the truck to Phil Glass, who continued to do it. But Phil also did plumbing. He plumbed 2 of my lofts.
Really?
He's a much better composer than he was a plumber. And he drove a cab. So the night of, right around the time that he did Einstein on the Beach at Lincoln Center in the Opera House, and the opera, we rented the Opera House.
You rented it?
A bunch of artists, we sold our works, and a couple of rich people came up with the rest of it, and they rented the Opera House for one night, and he did Einstein on the Beach, which now I'm sure the Metropolitan Opera claims as theirs, but at any rate, he went right back the next day to driving his cab. And this rather patrician lady was looking at the hack license, and she sees Philip Glass on the hack license. She said, "Young man, do you realize that you have the same name as a very famous composer?" And Phil didn't say a word. He just dropped her off.
Yeah.
But that's how we got along, how we got by. I had no heat the first 2 years I lived on Greene Street. I used to go to Don Nice's studio to shower one day a week. We slept under a bunch of blankets and an electric blanket. I didn't see my wife's body for 2 years.
Oh, gosh.
But
Great times.
I used to paint with an airbrush with a glove on and just my one finger sticking out that pushed the trigger because it was
Cold.
so cold. The water in the toilet would freeze overnight. And coffee in a pot and a cup would freeze overnight.
Gosh.
It was,
Yeah.
and yet I made I made all the black and white paintings in that space.
Okay. So what you're saying is that life in Soho made your work great.
Oh, I don't think anything guarantees that. It may be. I'll go this far. You know, in diving competitions,
Right.
there's a score for the dive and another score for the degree of difficulty. And to really win a diving, you have to have not only a score for the dive, but high degree of difficulty. And I think it does push you someplace.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that I taught 2 days a week at the School of Visual Arts, I made $4,000 a year. And we lived on $4,000 a year. And, you know,
You made it. You made it. You did it. I know that I remember seeing a painting that Larry Rivers made of the menu at Cedar Bar, you know, and it was like the prices were like outrageously low. A hot dog 25 cents or 10 cents or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was easy and it was possible. I know. So now in Soho, there were restaurants and so forth. Do you have any sort of story that might relate to that?
Well, I lived over a Cucci Fritos working man's restaurant called, what was his name?
Jerry's? Jerry's?
No, Jerry's was later. It was...
Cast? AK Cast?
No. At any rate, when we bought the building, a 7-story building, we bought it for $100,000.
Uh-huh.
So each floor was, you had to come up with...
Yeah, 15,000 maybe, yeah. 10,000.
Yeah, so yeah, we each needed, for the $30,000 down payment, 6 people had to come up with $5,000 each. And that was really tough. I had to borrow it from my wife's parents. And we bought the whole building for $100,000. And Hector's restaurant was on the ground floor. And he left because the workers in the neighborhood had left. And Jerry's moved in. Everyone in the building had wanted to sell the ground floor so that everybody would pay $1,000 less. I said, bullshit, we are not selling the ground floor. Someday, that's going to make us rich. Mm-hmm. So Jerry's moved in, and within 1 year, he was paying $100,000 a year in rent.
Wow.
So we got, we each got a check every month instead of paying
rent. Yeah.
Rent. You know, our heroes, many of them didn't start painting until they were 30 or 40 years old. And they didn't make any money at all for a long time. So we didn't think we thought we had all the time in the world and that we won't make any money for 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so you were very careful about what you chose to show. You were going to have to defend it for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big thing. But you used the word competitive, and I think we didn't have anything to compete for.
Mm-hmm.
We really helped each other.
Mm-hmm.
Richard had one paid assistant, that was Phil Glass. But he had Steve Reich, the composer. We had Rudy Wurlitzer,
Mm-hmm.
novelist. We had Bob Fiore, the filmmaker, and me. None of us were sculptors.
Mm-hmm.
So we could help him build his sculptures without any sense that we could be doing that. That was his. But it was not a very competitive time. We really did all pretty much help each other.